Good evening, Mount Zion family and friends. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for being here, whether you're on Facebook Live, you're on YouTube, or maybe you're listening back on the podcast. We so much appreciate your attendance of this virtual Bible study that we're going to have. We're so much blessed by your comments, your likes, and the little hearts. The hearts are my favorite, I think, and especially encouraged by so many people sharing the lessons that we've been putting out. This morning was a great encouragement to us. Brandon Kyles and myself sat down at the desk afterwards to begin uploading these services, the lesson, and by the time that I had finished preaching and the lesson was uploaded, there were already like 6-7 shares at that point. And so that was really encouraging. There's been over 500-600 people or so watch that or engage with it. Let's grow that number. Let's continue to share these messages that can be helpful for other people. Just thank you so much for the blessing that you are to us. I have to mention just for a moment thanks to our elders for the technology, allowing us to have the equipment and the products that we need to do these types of things, but also a big thanks to especially to Brandon Kyles and to his family, allowing him to get away from home to come here and to set all of this up. A huge thanks to him, even though he's behind the scenes than what I do. I just get to sit up here and talk a little bit. So just wanted to shout that appreciation out. Thank you for everything that all of you are doing, all the encouragement that you're doing at home, the phone calls that you're making, everything that you're doing during this time of hardship to be a blessing to others. And surely I believe that God will bless you and bless us because of it. Will you pray with me before we jump into our lesson this evening? Father God, we love you. We're so thankful for you. We pray that you will bless us through this Bible study, that you will be with us and guide our hearts and minds, that we can look into your word and we can study it and understand it so that we can apply it to our lives. We thank you so much for Jesus, for we know that all things come through him and the sacrifice that he freely gave us upon that cross and that day of Calvary, and that great love that he showed for us so that we too can learn to love you and love others. It's in Jesus' name I pray this prayer. Amen. Tonight I want to talk to us on Sunday nights, like we did last week, a lesson that relates to the lesson that we did for the kids. We released the kids lesson this morning about 10 o'clock, 10 or 10:15. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, go back after this lesson and watch it. Trust me, even if you're an adult, I think that you'll enjoy seeing that. At the very least, you'll enjoy seeing me being a little bit goofy and us interacting in different ways with that video. It was a lot of fun to put together. We look forward to more. We talked to the children, and I have been talking to the children about this idea of shining for Jesus, shining our light, based upon Matthew 5:14 and 15. And you know that charge as well as I, the command for us as Christ followers to shine our light for Jesus for the purpose of doing good works to glorify God who is in heaven. That is the purpose for us shining our lights. And so this morning we said that we can shine our lights by being compassionate and being giving. And thus you see the title of this lesson, Compassion and Generosity. Because I think this is an idea that we need to develop more and more. But even more so, this is an idea that we can develop very importantly during this time, the time that we face of being in quarantine because of this virus and all of the many complications and difficulties that come from it. I believe it is of most importance that we understand what it means to be generous and compassionate during this time, maybe more than ever. And yes, I am straightly speaking about the idea of being generous with monetarily, being generous with our funds, and continually giving to the church, even though we're not gathering at the building. We are gathering as saints, and we need to continue to give to the church by the means that the elders have set up for us right now, so that the Lord's work will continue going on. Listen, this virus has got us down, which has been under attack. We're going to read tonight about times that the church has been under attack, even in the first century, right after Jesus had left this world and ascended to the right hand of the throne of God. The church immediately fell under attack. There's been many times through all the centuries that we've faced that the church has fallen under attack. Sometimes it's been a direct attack, sometimes indirect. Right now, you call it what you want, but I believe that the church is under attack. We've been under attack for a long time based upon our culture and society and the way people respond to the church, the way people speak about the church and fight the values of Christianity. But even so, right now, we find ourselves in a little bit more personal attack, if you will, because we have been restricted, not only because of the dangers of the illness, but a lot of states have been restricted by the law of gatherings of so many people, more than so many people. And so legally mandated, we've been restricted in a lot of ways. Now, this is not a political debate or discussion for us to talk about what the state, what the government can do versus church and all that stuff. I'm not here to talk about that. I don't want to talk about any of that at any time. It's not the business I'm here to talk about. But what I am here to talk about is how we persevere even through the times of trial. And right now is a time of trial. You know that. We've talked about that extensively. We've mentioned it through these virtual Bible studies. But the Lord's work continues to go on. That is the bottom line. Although we are under attack, although worship looks different, although our gathering is different right now, we need to continue to understand that the Lord's work continues to go on. Mission work in this world continues to go on. Discipleship, evangelism, being the light that we're called to be continues to go on. Worship of God, praise to the Father, glorifying Him, bringing honor to His name, serving the widows and the orphans. All of those things continue to go on. They will never end. They will never end, because this is the mission and the work of the church. You heard Jesus' prayer this morning. You heard His entire mission. Your will be done. That's what He says to the Father. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Do you hear what Jesus is trying to say? God's will be done. God's will must be done. We have to decide, are we going to be the vessel by which He uses to make sure that His will is done? You see, God desperately desires for us to commit to Him, and we should desperately desire to commit to Him. But whether we choose to or not, we can rest assured that God's will always be done. Not everything that's done or said or happens in this world is always God's will, but God's will is always done. It does always come to completion. And so with that, we understand the Lord's work continues, and when the Lord's work continues, there are certain things that we need to do as Christians to ensure that we are taking our part, doing our part, and making sure the Lord's work continues. And one of those things is being compassionate and generous, or simply giving of all of our means and all of ourselves in service towards the work of the Lord. And that's one thing that it's easy to get away from, not just now, but all the time. Boy, isn't it easy just to say, hey, I'm not going to give this time, I'll give next time. I'm not going to be generous this time, I'll be generous next time. Maybe you've even been in a situation before where you see somebody is in need of help, where they need the compassion of another. Maybe it's somebody who needs to be picked up off the ground because they've fallen, or somebody whose car won't start, and you know how to help start that, or at least you know who to call. And you kind of walk up and you get that pit in your stomach. You know that pit in your stomach where you get to thinking, listen, I know as a Christ follower I need to be proactive and reactive, and I need to go up and I need to help this individual who's in need right now. And you're kind of on that way, you're moving inside you. There's this tension battling with you. Am I going to do what's natural and just walk away, or am I going to do what's not natural, what's holy and righteous, and help out somebody who's in need? And we have that pit in our stomach, and then all of a sudden we walk away, and maybe we have regrets about not helping. We see somebody else helps, or whatever the case may be. It's easy just to kind of walk by, isn't it? It's easy just to let it go and move on instead of being generous. And even when it comes to our giving, Maybe we forget to bring our money, or we forget to bring the checkbook, or we forget to bring these things to worship with us, and we say, "Oh, we'll just get it tonight," and then we forget in the evening, or "Oh, we just, we forgot this week, so we'll do double next week." If we're real with each other, if we're honest, is that something that we really actually do? Is it something that we really actually are going to take a part in and saying, okay, well, I didn't give this week, so I'll give double next week? Is that really something that we would do? Maybe it is for you. Maybe that is something that you really would practice and do. But I think for most people, generally speaking, the thing is it's just always easier to neglect than it is to actually take part in giving. And the reason that it's easier to neglect giving is because of the mindset that we always have, this mindset of get over give, where we want to get stuff instead of give something. And that's the mindset that we have as human beings, but it's not the mindset that Christ has called us to. Instead, we need to have the mindset of being people who are generous in giving. Giving of everything, giving of ourselves, giving of our monies, giving of our material belongings, so on and so forth. That's the mindset of Christ. That's the mindset of a Christ follower. That's the mindset that you and I need to have in order to be people who are committed to following God. I want to read to you the book of Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, and starting in verse 22, about this idea of giving and generosity, because we see it often in the Bible. Look here in verse 22 of Romans 15. Paul says, "This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while." We'll just pause real quick right there. Did you see what Paul says? He's telling the Romans that he deeply desires to come to them, and after he comes to the Romans, he wants to then leave on and do work, a mission work, teaching of the gospel, the good news of Christ, in Spain, an area that otherwise we don't have an account of anybody going to during this time. Paul wants to go, but he says something significant here, especially regarding the responsibilities of the saints at the church in Rome. He says, when I go to Spain, I hope that you will help me. And what he means is that they will help him in all ways, make sure that he can do the work of the Lord while in Spain. That's fascinating. That's a concept of being generous and compassionate. I want us to continue on in verse 25 and read about what Paul talks about when he talks about people who have given to good causes and been generous. At present, however, I am going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. Now, this is a concept we'll explore in just a moment in the book of Acts, but he's going back to Jerusalem to bring all of the contributions he's been collecting over these times of journey as he's gone through these different churches and collected the generosity of the saints at these different locations. Verse 26, and he talks about this. Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Macedonia, this is Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, that's those types of churches there. We read about those churches in the book of Acts. We even have some letters that are written to some of those churches. And then Achaia, that's the church of the Corinthians, that's Corinth. And so we're going to explore some of these areas and look at what Paul has to say about giving to these different churches. Verse 27, "For they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings." Do you notice what Paul says here? This is fascinating in itself as well. He says that the Gentiles, these people in Macedonia and Achaia, these Gentile Christians, these non-Jewish Christians, if you will, he says they have a responsibility. They owe it to the Christians in Jerusalem. Let me ask you, what type of Christians were in Jerusalem? The majority of them. It was Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, the majority of them anyways. And Paul says that the Gentile Christians owed it to the Jewish Christians that they were to give their material belongings. Why would they owe that to them? Well, he said because the Jewish Christians shared something with the Gentile Christians. Now, we don't have time to explore this entire concept, but the idea here is, what did the Jewish Christians share with the Gentile Christians? Well, he says it. He said, Gentiles have come to share in what? To share in the spiritual blessings. The spiritual blessings is what they shared with those Jewish Christians. Then they ought also to service or share with their material blessings. This idea here, if nothing else, it just shows the concept of generosity, of whatever one has, of being caring and sharing and giving in what you've been blessed with. Whether spiritual blessings, material blessings, or anything in between. The idea of being generous and sharing and giving. This is what Paul's talking about here. This is what he's telling the Romans about, so that he can prepare the Romans when he comes, so that they're prepared to help out Paul in any way that they see fit and are able to help when he goes to Spain to teach the good news of Jesus. Do you notice what's going on? Do you see the generosity that Paul's talking about? Well, just for a few minutes tonight, let's explore some of the things that's going on and the reason why Paul is taking up of collections and generosity from these different churches at different places. Chapter 11. Acts chapter 11. What we see here is Paul and Barnabas getting ready to be sent off for this first missionary journey. And they're there in Antioch, and I wanted to read to us in verse 27 of chapter 11 in the book of Acts what's going on with the church in Judea, in the area of Jerusalem. And verse 27 says, "Now in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul." We see here this very first telling of the famine that's going to occur. Somewhere in the mid-40s AD, this famine, this great famine that's going to cripple and attack the church, the saints there in Jerusalem and Judea. And so Paul and Barnabas are sent out by the elders at Antioch to go up and collect from each one how much ever they can give by whatever their means are. They're going around to collect up these collections, these funds, so that they can bring aid back to the Christians, the Jewish Christians there in Judea and Jerusalem. That's what's going on in this particular section of Scripture. Now, if you fast forward a couple chapters, you're going to see Paul going through his second missionary journey, his third missionary journey, and during these times, in the second journey, he goes through Asia Minor. And we read about, through different accounts going through Asia Minor on the second and third missionary journeys, how he brought with him, especially in third, he brought with him all of these extra people. And he brings with him all of these extra people, probably for the purpose of protection and making sure that the funds that were given, the giving, the generosity, the alms, and all these things that were given were accounted for and were protected along their journey. But we see highlighted through different texts through these journeys that Paul is going about collecting of these different generous gifts from the saints of different churches in Asia Minor, Galatia and Ephesus, on over into Macedonia, which we've already read about, Thessalonica and Philippi and Berea and so forth, and on down into Achaia, there in Corinth, where Paul consequently stays for a good period of time, teaching and preaching to the saints there and establishing that first century church in that location. And so you fast forward all the way to chapter 24, you see these different occurrences. And then what you see in chapter 24 is Paul returning to Jerusalem after this third missionary journey. When he returns to Jerusalem, here's what happens in verse 17. "Now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings." Here is the delivering of all that collecting Paul has done, Paul and his counterparts have done over time. Really, if you read Acts chapter 11, the church in Antioch sending Barnabas and Paul off, you can read in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10 about James and Cephas and John who encourage Paul through his mission works to remember those who are poor. And Paul says, this is what I was eager to do as he went out on these journeys. I was eager to remember the poor. I was eager to collect of these offerings so that I can give to those who are desperately in need. We'll read in a moment 1 Corinthians 16 about Paul talking to the church in Corinth about the need to support the Christians in Jerusalem. We'll read in a moment about 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. Once again, Paul talking about that great mission work, which he calls an act of grace. We read about in Romans chapter 15 the need for Paul to raise support, not only for his work, but for the needs of the saints in Jerusalem and Judea. And then finally, you read here in Acts 24:17, the idea that Paul's bringing those things back to the church and giving as they had need. So turn on over to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Now, the church in Corinth had a lot of problems. They had a lot of issues that Paul dealt with. They dealt with things like division, dealt with things like sexual immorality, dealt with things like the resurrection. There were some who were saying the resurrection didn't happen, that it wasn't important. And Paul comes back screaming, saying, yes, it was. He dealt with things like the misuse of spiritual gifts during their gatherings and so on and so forth. But then at the very conclusion of this letter, here's what Paul says. At the conclusion of his letter, he reminds the Corinthian of this great act of grace in verses 1 and 2. Now concerning the collection of the saints, the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, this is Sunday, this is a reference to the day of the Lord's rising, which is the reference to when we gather together, the command to take up of this collection on this first day of the week. He says, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Those who you accredit by letter are some of the references we made about the people who were with Paul during his missionary journey there on that third journey. Verse 4, if it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. Okay, and so we see what's going on here. The church in Corinth receives this letter. And they received this letter because they had written a letter and sent reports back to Paul that there was some trouble going on. Those divisions and sexual immorality, the gathering issues, the resurrection issues, all these problems that were going on with the church in Corinth. And so Paul here in verse 1 of chapter 16, he says, concerning that collection that you wrote about of giving. Have you ever heard anybody talk about or question the idea of giving today, of us giving of our funds? I'll tell you what, I've heard a lot of jokes that are said really often in distaste. They say things like, well, preachers just preach about giving because they want to get paid and things like that. Now, I'm not saying anybody here's ever made jokes like that. I certainly hope not. I certainly hope that we wouldn't say those things. But I've heard others say jokes like that, and it's jokes that we shouldn't make because it's not just a paycheck that the funds are going towards, but instead it's the work of the Lord. It's the work of the Lord's church, and we've installed elders even here at Mount Zion who are over the use and the utilization of the funds, the generosity of the saints and those funds and how they ought to be used to support the growing of the kingdom. And the Corinthians here have a mindset that sometimes I think we have people today. We have to give. What's the necessity of giving? Other people they can help themselves. There's different issues going on here in Corinth that Paul needs to write to them concerning this idea, the idea of being generous. And so after the letter of 1 Corinthians concludes, we see in the second letter that Paul writes to them probably a letter in between 1 and 2 Corinthians. And he visits them, and the visit doesn't go well because people don't appreciate Paul, and they're saying Paul is not a good teacher, not an apostle, he's not a polished speaker, all these different things. Paul even calls these people in 2 Corinthians super apostles who come in and claim that they're greater and better than Paul. And Paul says, wait a minute, no. If we want to put our resumes next to each other, let's go ahead and do that, because I can assure you my resume far outweighs your resume. And Paul ultimately says, well, none of that matters anyways. What matters is that I am made strong through my weaknesses, because in our weaknesses is where God is glorified. And so there's a lot of issues going on in between the letters of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. But about a year or so after Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he writes this letter 2 Corinthians, which may have been the third letter he actually wrote to them. And he writes this letter and he addresses some of the very issues that the Corinthians did not take into account during his first letter, and even that visit that when he goes back to Achaia there and visits them. And one of the things he writes about in great detail and depth is the idea of generosity. I want us to turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and read through here for the remainder of our lesson. This idea of generosity, because Paul has really some phenomenal things to say that apply to us still today on how we ought to be generous. As a matter of fact, he compares our generosity as an act of grace to the act of grace that Jesus gave us through his death. Let's read and find out what I mean. He says in verse 1 of chapter 8, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches in Macedonia." Remember, that's Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, these churches up north of Corinth. Okay? Severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. He said they didn't have to give, but they gave anyways. And what I mean they didn't have wasn't that it wasn't a command. When I say they didn't have to give, is they didn't have it. They did not have it to give it away, but they did anyways. They gave it away, even in the severe affliction and in their extreme poverty. They overflowed in a wealth of generosity. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means. They didn't have it to give it. They gave beyond their means, of their own accord. It wasn't me commanding it. It was them desiring to do it. It says in verse 4, "Begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urge Titus, that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace." The act of grace is giving. Listen to what Paul says in verse 7. "But as you excel in everything," it wasn't that they didn't have good qualities or characteristics, but instead Paul says, "You Corinthians, you excelled in these ways, in faith and speech and knowledge and all earnestness and in our love for you. See that you also excel in this act of grace." He is telling the Corinthians that it is a command and a responsibility of the daily Christ follower to be a person of generosity and giving. Yes, we have the command to lay by in store for the collecting of the first day of the week, but our generosity does not stop on Sundays. Our generosity continues every day of the week. It's a 24/7 act. It's the same as being faithful and genuine and giving and building up and speech, producing good fruits. It's a part of the Christian walk. It's a part of giving grace to God. Paul will later say that giving and generosity is so important that it is a part of the gospel message, the good news. Let's continue reading. Verse 8. "I say this not as a command, but to prove by earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in this matter I gave my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire it." So a year ago, when he wrote 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 4, that's when they start this work. They desired this work, to take up of the collection of the saints, to give to those who were in need. But now some people are having some trouble with that. I don't know if this generosity thing is a good thing. So Paul compares it to the greatest act of grace and generosity that mankind has ever known. That Jesus leaves his throne on high. He leaves his throne on high, and in an act of grace and generosity, he comes to the earth. And he comes to the earth not only to become human in flesh, but to give of his life. And he gives of his life in this poverty of the earth, this poverty of flesh, so that we who are in flesh, we who are sinful, can be gifted this grace of salvation, can be covered by the blood that was poured, can be redeemed by the act of Christ, by this act of grace. And we who are in poverty in the flesh, because of what Jesus does, going from the throne to the earth and dying on that cross, we in poverty are then raised up into newness of life and creation and resurrection because of the act of grace that Jesus demonstrated. And Paul compares our generosity to this act of grace that we have. And because we have, we must become lowly and give. And when we give, those who are lowly and in need of, they will be raised up. It's this act of giving of ourselves, humbling ourselves down so that others can be raised up, so that others can be helped. It's the idea of something that's not comfortable, that's not safe, that's not something that's going to feel good. It's the idea of doing something so that others can be exalted and so that others can be met with their needs, not so that we can be selfish and have and have and have. That's what's going on here in this act of grace that Paul's talking about. He literally compares Jesus giving of his life, an act of grace, to the level of generosity that we must have. Now let me ask you, friends, is that the level of generosity that you and I have? Do we have that type of generosity to give of everything? To be completely trusting that God will provide no matter what we give. That's what the Christians in Macedonia did. They gave beyond their needs because they heard somebody was in need. Somebody was hurting. Somebody needed, and they said they needed even more than they did. And so they gave. And they gave trusting and knowing that God would provide. And sometimes God's blessings today, we don't see them in material ways. We won't always see God's blessings in material ways. Maybe God doesn't always bless us in material ways, but He does bless us. And whatever we sow, we will reap. Not necessarily in material ways, but in eternal ways, in spiritual ways. Read on with me in verse 10. Verse 11. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their needs, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, whoever gathered little had no lack. So what does he say here? Well, to start out, he says, give with what you have. I'm not expecting you to give something you don't have. Give what you're able to give. Be generous in the ways that you're able to be generous. And then he compares it to this idea of fairness. This goes back to that same idea that we read about in Romans chapter 15. The idea of the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians. How the Jewish Christians shared in these spiritual blessings. The Gentile Christians can then share in these material blessings. Paul's just saying, whatever you have to be generous with, be generous with it. One time somebody gave Annalena and I, we were looking for farm-raised eggs, and so somebody from Mount Zion gifted us eggs. And that was their part of their generosity towards other people. That was a wonderful act, and we were so appreciative of that generosity. Sometimes our generosity is in monetary or material things. Sometimes our generosity is in emotional help or spiritual help. Paul's just saying, be fair. Everybody give of everything that you have. Whatever you have, be willing to give it so that others can be built up. Then he goes into chapter 9. And here's where we'll conclude with this lesson. What he talks about in chapter 9. This idea that we read often at the Lord's table before we do the contribution on Sunday mornings. Being a cheerful giver. Let's read a little bit about this and finish our lesson. Now it is superfluous for me, in verse 1. Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an expectation, which just means expecting something in return. Here's what Paul says. Well, I hope that nobody ever says this of me. He says, listen, I've been here in Macedonia, and I'm speaking you guys up. I'm talking y'all up. I'm saying, hey, the Corinthians, they're going to give. They're so ready to give. They're so willing and desiring to give of everything they have to help out those in need. And he says, but I was just thinking, because we had some issues last time with you guys, I wanted to go ahead and send some people ahead of me so they get there first and they remind you that you're supposed to be willing and desiring and ready to give. Because I don't want to show up with the Macedonians with me and you guys say, sorry, Paul, we forgot. We forgot that we were ready to give, and we don't really have a whole lot of here. Take this change in my pocket here. Just do what you can. He says, no, it's in your hearts. It's a desire. So I'm sending people ahead of me so that they remember, so we're not humiliated when we get there. And you people who say you are generous, who say you're Christ followers, all of a sudden forget to give and be generous. And so Paul does that, and he reminds them that our giving is a willing gift. It's a gift that we give because we want to give, because we desire to give, not begrudgingly or not expecting something in return. Read with me in verse 6. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Here's this idea that we need to look at. This idea here that Paul's talking about. We won't always see the reaping of what we sow here in this world, but we will surely see it whenever eternity comes. Or we may see the reaping of what we sow as more continued opportunities to be gracious and generous in giving to other people. What I mean is maybe God sometimes blesses us because of our generosity by giving us opportunity to be generous again. And I have to tell you, when I'm generous and giving towards others, it actually does kind of feel good. It might sting a little as I give that money out, or as I give this time out, or as I give that energy here and there. That might sting, but that's just a temporary pain or ache, if you will. Well, most of the time it really doesn't hurt that bad at all. Instead, it makes me feel pretty good, because I've done what God has asked me to do. I bet you feel the same way when you give. I think you probably understand what I'm talking about. Read with me in verse 8. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency, or another word, contentment, so that having all contentment in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work, as it is written, He has distributed freely. He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. Boy, I wish that I would not have wasted so much time at the beginning talking about things so that I could read to you Psalms chapter 111 and 112. Paul here quotes Psalms 112. And I want you to go back and read it after this message is done, because Psalms chapter 112 is an acrostic psalm. It's just like Psalm 11 is an acrostic psalm, and they go together for these reasons. I believe when Paul wrote this section of the book of 2 Corinthians, he was thinking of Psalms chapter 111 and 112. An acrostic just means that each sentence or each stanza that follows started with the successive or following Hebrew letter. Okay, so it'd be like this one starts with A, this one starts with B and C, and so on. The acrostic measure doesn't matter except for to show the similarities between 111 and 112. But here's what does matter. Psalm chapter 112 shows the character of the man who is giving, abundantly giving, and how through his giving you see his righteousness in God. That's the whole theme of Psalm chapter 112, that the righteous man is a generous man. Well, why does Psalm 111 matter? Psalm 111 matters so much because it shows the character of God. You see, Psalm 111, it comes before Psalm 112, just in case you didn't know that. And in Psalm chapter 111, what is so fascinating is it shows God the giver. It goes through this entire psalm, these 10 verses of God giving and being overly giving in his generosity towards mankind. It's the same concept. God gives, man gives. God gives, man gives. Because God gives, then man gives. God's generosity becomes man's generosity. And man is only generous because God is generous. You understand, in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul is talking about that. This act of grace that God has done, the great giving and generosity that He has showed people, that's the level of generosity that we must show others, that we must give like. This includes giving of all of ourselves, our service, our time, and it includes the collection of the saints. Let us not forget that 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul is specifically talking about generosity in the form of taking up of the collection of the saints so that he has an offering to bring back to the saints who were in Jerusalem and Judea who are suffering in the midst of the church being attacked by this famine. We finish reading here in verse 10. He who supplied seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. This is the act of a righteous man. You will be enriched in every way, to be generous in every way. You're going to be enriched because of your generosity. He says, which through us will provide thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints. Paul here is saying again, because of your generosity, God will be generous towards you. Your generosity shows, your giving shows righteousness. And now what he's going to say here is that your giving is not the only gift, is not the only blessing. Watch here in verse 12. The ministry of this service, your giving of the collection, your generosity towards the saints, the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. If you've ever received a gift from somebody, what do you do in return? Well, most people say, thank you. And whenever people receive a gift in the name of God, where does the thanks go towards? Towards God. Their giving is resulting in people thanking God. Verse 13. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ, the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you. Thanks be to God for His inexpressible gift. What do we learn here? We learn the need to be a great giver, to be a generous and compassionate person of God. In our contribution, in our lives, in our time, our energy, everything in every way. When we have, we must be willing to give. We're people who are defined by our service, by our giving, by our generosity. Paul in these verses expresses the idea that being generous, even generous through contribution, is not only an act of worship, but it's an act of telling and portraying the good news of Jesus Christ. Because he compares our generosity and the way that we should give and are commanded to give to the idea and the act of Jesus leaving His throne to come to this earth to give in His act of grace as well. That's the seriousness and severity of what's going on here. Furthermore, he says this little tidbit in there about how people allow the giving to occur. You know, Jesus says that it is greater to give than to receive. Sometimes we need receivers in order to allow people the blessing of being givers. So while we don't always need to be receivers, we always need to be givers. We don't always need to be receivers. We also need to accept the act of those who are trying to give. So during this time, maybe you're sitting at home and you're not feeling well, or you're elderly, or you're in a situation where it's not safe for you to go out. Allow somebody to be generous. Allow them to follow the gospel of Christ. Allow them to follow the command of giving and being compassionate. And allow them, when they offer, to go out and buy your groceries to help you in your time of need. Allow them to cook you a meal, and so on and so forth. Allowing people to be generous givers is another act of being a person of God. Because being a generous giver is a command from God. And so what do we do with this? Well, right now we need to remember not to neglect the act of worship and the act of portraying and telling the gospel of Christ and being generous through our contribution. Maybe now, more than any time ever before in our lives, does the church still need your generosity so that its work can continue to go on. The elders have set up ways for us to be generous through our contribution, and we need to take heed of those ways. Mailing checks to the church building, dropping them off at the mailbox, and I can assure you this, when that gets dropped off, it gets picked up immediately so that it's not left out there. And there's other ways that you can give too. If you have a concern about dropping off or mailing to the mailbox, contact us. Contact me. If you don't know my number, comment below. I don't know your number. I'll contact you, and I'll get you that number. I'll get you that way that you can contribute and be generous. But there's other ways, just as I told the children, that we can be generous and compassionate and giving towards people who are desperately in need of Christians to step up and be generous and compassionate and giving. Let's not be like those Corinthian Christians who at times, in their times of greatest disservice towards God, they neglected of doing what they had committed themselves to do in the first place. If we call ourselves Christ followers, then we are to be servants, people of generosity, of grace and mercy and forgiveness, people who love and who serve. I know and am confident that you, Mount Zion family, are those type of people, the people who are generous and giving. Let's make sure that we show it, to shine our light, not for our glory, but for the Lord, to show good works for the glory of God. I love you so much. I miss all of you desperately. I really, really do. And I can't wait for us once again to be able to gather together. But for now, let us use this time of family time and devotion and time of peace in our quarantine homes to be the people who God has called us to be. Hope you have a great night and a great week.